In the heart of downtown Chicago, where skyscrapers kissed the clouds and streets buzzed with life, stood a police precinct that had seen better days. The building itself was old, its walls cracked, paint peeling, but it wasn't just the structure, showing signs of wear. Inside, tensions simmered like a pot about to boil over. For years, scandals had plagued this department. Whispers of corruption, complaints about excessive force, and accusations of racial profiling made headlines almost weekly. Trust between the officers and the community they served was at an all-time low. The morale inside the station was no better. Officers walked around with slumped shoulders, avoiding eye contact. Some grumbled about how nothing ever changed. Others blamed the system for tying their hands. Leadership came and went faster than anyone could keep track. Each new chief promised sweeping reforms but left before making any real impact. It felt like the department was stuck in a loop, unable to break free from its toxic cycle. Then one Monday morning, everything shifted. Word spread quickly through the halls. A new boss was coming. Not just any boss, but someone sent straight from federal oversight. This wasn't another local guy climbing the ranks or a familiar face recycled from within. No, this time it was different. The new chief arrived wearing a tailored suit, exuding confidence despite the storm brewing around him. He didn't smile when he stepped into the room. Instead, his sharp gaze scanned every officer present, as if sizing them up. Standing tall, on the makeshift stage, an old desk pushed to the front of the briefing room, he addressed the crowd. His voice was calm, steady, yet carried enough weight to silence even the most stubborn skeptics. "I'm not here to make friends," he began, pausing briefly to let those words sink in. "I'm here to fix what you've broken." You could hear a pin drop. Some officers exchanged nervous glances while others clenched their jaws, clearly unimpressed. To many of the white officers who wore their badges like armor, believing it shielded them from criticism, this announcement felt like a direct challenge. Who did this outsider think he was? Coming into their house, telling them how things should be done? They'd been doing this job long before he showed up, hadn't they? Behind closed doors, murmurs turned into outright complaints. "He doesn't know us," one officer muttered during lunch break. "How's he supposed to lead if he doesn't understand our struggles?" Another chimed in, shaking his head. "Mark my words, he won't last 6 months." Their skepticism wasn't hard to miss. It filled the air like static electricity. But there was something else too, something quieter but equally powerful. A few officers sat silently, watching the drama unfold without joining in. These were the ones who'd grown tired of the status quo, who wanted change but never believed it was possible. They studied the new chief carefully, wondering if maybe, just maybe, he might actually mean what he said. As for the man himself, he didn't waste time settling in. Within hours of his arrival, he requested access to internal files, reviewed past cases, and started asking tough questions. Nothing seemed off limits. When he noticed certain folders missing or reports conveniently misplaced, he didn't raise his voice. Instead, he simply ordered replacements, refusing to let anything stand in his way. His actions spoke louder than any speech ever could. He wasn't playing games. By the end of the first day, opinions were divided. Some saw him as a threat, a symbol of everything they feared, change forced upon them by outsiders who didn't understand their world. Others, however, saw hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the fresh start they'd been waiting for. Either way, one thing was clear. This new boss wasn't going anywhere anytime soon, and whether they liked it or not, he was about to shake things up in ways none of them could have imagined. For now, though, the precinct remained a powder keg, ready to explode at the slightest spark. Only time would tell which direction the wind would blow, and whose side it would favor. The new chief's arrival sent shockwaves through the department, but resistance didn't take long to rear its head. From day one, it was clear that not everyone was ready to embrace change, or even tolerate it. Some officers openly mocked the boss behind his back, calling him the outsider or worse. They resented the fact that he hadn't come up through their ranks, that he didn't share their history or understand their struggles. To them, His presence felt like an insult, a slap in the face to everything they believed the badge stood for. One officer in particular became the unofficial leader of the dissenters, a grizzled veteran nearing retirement named Greg. He'd spent decades on the force, weathering scandals and reforms alike, and had grown cynical over the years. Greg prided himself on being old school, someone who followed the unspoken rules of policing rather than the ones written down in manuals. When the new chief announced mandatory anti-bias training sessions and stricter oversight on body camera footage, Greg scoffed loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This guy thinks he can just waltz in here and rewrite the playbook? Let's see how far he gets," he muttered during roll call, earning nods of agreement from some of his colleagues. Resistance wasn't limited to snide remarks either. Officers began testing the limits, seeing how far they could push back without crossing the line. A few refused to follow basic directives, claiming they didn't recognize the chief's authority because he hadn't earned it the right way. Others filed frivolous grievances, accusing him of micromanaging or unfairly targeting white officers during routine inspections. Every move he made seemed to spark another wave of defiance. But what really set tempers flaring was when the chief started digging into cold cases, ones that had been quietly shelved under previous administrations. One case in particular caught his attention: the fatal shooting of a young black man several years earlier. The incident had sparked protests. At the time, with many questioning whether the officers involved had acted appropriately, yet despite overwhelming evidence suggesting misconduct, no charges were ever filed against them. For the chief, this case symbolized everything wrong with the department: the lack of accountability, the culture of silence, the systemic biases that ran deep. When he brought up the case in a meeting with senior staff, the room went eerily quiet. Captain Linda, a longtime administrator known for her ability to navigate tricky situations, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She tried to deflect responsibility, insisting that reopening such a high-profile case would only stir up trouble. "You think exposing this will help anyone?" she asked, her tone sharp. "It'll only divide us further." The chief didn't blink. He knew full well the risks involved, but he also understood the stakes. This wasn't just about one case, it was about sending a message. If the department couldn't hold itself accountable, then who would? With quiet determination, he pressed forward, ordering a thorough review of the evidence. What he uncovered was damning: surveillance footage showing inconsistencies in the officers' accounts, internal memos revealing pressure from higher-ups to bury the investigation, and witness statements that had been ignored or dismissed outright. Word of the chief's findings spread quickly, igniting a firestorm within the precinct. Some officers were furious, accusing him of playing politics or trying to tarnish the department's reputation. Others grew nervous, wondering if they might be next on his list. Anonymous notes began appearing on his desk overnight, warning him to back off. Cars parked near his home were vandalized, tires slashed and windows smashed. Still, none of these threats deterred him. If anything, they only strengthened his resolve. Each act of intimidation served as a reminder of why his work mattered so much. Meanwhile, tensions continued to simmer among the rank and file. Roll calls became tense affairs, with officers exchanging heated glances, but rarely speaking directly to one another. Conversations in the break room turned into whispered arguments, each side digging in deeper. Those loyal to Greg saw the chief as an enemy, someone determined to tear apart the fabric of their brotherhood. Others, however, began to wonder if, maybe, just maybe, he was onto something. One afternoon, a young officer named Elena found herself caught in the middle of the growing divide. Elena had joined the force 5 years earlier, driven by a desire to serve her community. But over time, she'd grown disillusioned, frustrated by the double standards and the way marginalized voices were often silenced. When the chief arrived, she felt a flicker of hope, a chance to finally address the issues she'd struggled with for years. Yet voicing her support openly came with risks. Aligning herself with the new boss could alienate her from her peers, making her a target for ridicule or worse. Elena wrestled with her decision for days, weighing the pros and cons. Finally, she decided to reach out, not publicly, but privately. After hours, when most of the station was empty, she knocked on the chief's office door. He looked up from his desk, surprised to see her standing there. Without preamble, she said, "I know what you're trying to do and I want to help." Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly. The chief listened intently as she shared insights into ongoing corruption schemes, officers running illegal side hustles, selling confiscated goods online, and turning a blind eye to misconduct in exchange for favors. Together they began piecing together a network of bad actors operating within the department. It was risky work, requiring secrecy and precision, but Elena felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, she believed real change might actually be possible. As the weeks passed, cracks began forming in the wall of resistance. Not everyone was ready to admit fault, but some officers started questioning whether their defiance was worth it. Was protecting the status quo really more important than doing the right thing? Slowly, hesitantly, a few began reaching out to the chief, offering information, or expressing cautious support. These small gestures gave him hope, reinforcing his belief that even the hardest hearts could soften given time. Still, the battle was far from over. Lieutenant Gregg remained a vocal opponent, rallying his supporters and filing petitions demanding the chief's removal. He argued that the reforms were divisive, claiming they undermined morale and put officers at risk. His argument struck a chord with some, especially those who felt overwhelmed by the rapid changes. Yet city officials, impressed by the progress already underway, including plummeting civilian complaints and improved clearance rates, threw their full support behind the chief. For the first time, it seemed possible that the tide might actually turn. Through it all, the chief remained steadfast. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also understood the importance of staying the course. Every challenge, every obstacle, only reinforced his commitment to building a better future, not just for the department but for the community it served. And while the resistance showed no signs of fading completely, there were moments when it felt like the walls might finally start coming down. The deeper the chief dug into the department's past, the more secrets he uncovered. Secrets that had been buried for years, hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and silence. It was like peeling back the skin of an onion, each layer revealing something uglier than the last. The case of the young black man's fatal shooting wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of misconduct, cover-ups, and systemic failures that stretched far beyond what anyone had imagined. When the chief finally gathered enough evidence to confront Captain Linda, the administrator implicated in burying the case, he didn't mince words. He called her into his office late one evening, closing the door behind them. The room felt heavy, the kind of tension that made it hard to breathe. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the chief broke the silence. "I know you were involved," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You helped sweep this under the rug." Linda stiffened, her face turning pale. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she stammered, "You think exposing this will fix anything? All it'll do is tear us apart." The chief leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "This isn't about tearing anything apart," he replied. "It's about accountability. If we can't hold ourselves accountable, how can we expect the community to trust us?" Linda looked away, her shoulders slumping. She knew he was right, but admitting it felt like betrayal, not just of herself, but of everyone who'd come before her. In her mind, covering up the case hadn't been about protecting bad cops. It had been about protecting the department from public scrutiny, about keeping the peace within their ranks. But now, staring at the mountain of evidence on the chief's desk, she realized the cost of that decision. It wasn't just the victim's family who had suffered. It was the entire community, eroded by mistrust and fear. The next morning, the chief held a press conference. Reporters packed the room, cameras flashing as he stepped up to the podium. Behind him stood members of the victim's family, their faces etched with pain, but also determination. When the chief began speaking, his voice carried a weight that silenced even the skeptics. "Today we take a step toward justice," he said, pausing to let the words sink in. After years of unanswered questions and unresolved pain, we are holding those responsible for this tragedy accountable. He announced disciplinary actions against several officers linked to the cover-up, demotions, suspensions, and referrals to internal affairs for further investigation. The room erupted in murmurs as reporters scribbled notes and snapped photos. Outside, news trucks lined the streets, broadcasting the story live to a city hungry for answers. The announcement sent shockwaves through the department. Some officers applauded the move, seeing it as a long overdue reckoning. Others fumed, accusing the chief of throwing his own people under the bus. Anonymous notes appeared on his desk again, this time laced with anger and desperation. Cars parked near his home were vandalized once more, tires slashed and windows shattered. Yet none of these threats shook his resolve. If anything, they only fueled his determination to see this through. Amidst the chaos, Elena, the young officer who had quietly aligned herself with the chief, found herself walking a tightrope. On one side were her colleagues, many of whom viewed her growing closeness to the boss with suspicion. On the other side was her conscience, urging her to keep pushing for change despite the risks. One afternoon, while grabbing coffee in the break room, she overheard two officers talking about her. "She's gotten cozy with him, hasn't she?" one whispered, nodding toward the chief's office. "Think she's trying to climb the ladder?" "To," others snorted. "More like digging her own grave." Elena pretended not to hear, focusing instead on stirring her coffee. Her hands trembled slightly, but she forced herself to stay calm. She knew the comments weren't just idle gossip. They were warnings, subtle reminders that stepping out of line came with consequences. Still, she refused to back down. Every time she thought about giving up, she remembered why she joined the force in the first place: to make a difference. And if making a difference meant standing alone, then so be it. With Elena's help, the chief continued unraveling the web of corruption within the department. Together, they uncovered a network of officers running illegal side hustles. Everything, from drug trafficking to selling confiscated goods online. The operation was sophisticated, involving senior commanders who used their positions to protect themselves and their accomplices. When the chief presented his findings to city officials, they were shocked and furious. "This goes deeper than we ever imagined," one official said during a closed-door meeting. "How could this have happened right under our noses?" The chief didn't sugarcoat his response. "Because no one wanted to look too closely," he said. "We've built a system where loyalty trumps integrity, where looking the other way is easier than facing the truth." Armed with irrefutable evidence, the chief orchestrated a sting operation to bring the culprits to justice. Officers posing as buyers infiltrated the network, gathering enough intel to secure warrants. Early one morning, teams of investigators descended on multiple locations, arresting key players and seizing cash, drugs, and stolen property. The raids made headlines across the country, shining a spotlight on the department's darkest corners. For some officers, the arrests were a wake-up call. They realized they couldn't keep hiding behind the badge, pretending their actions didn't have consequences. Slowly, hesitantly, they began reaching out to the chief, offering information or expressing cautious support. These small gestures gave him hope, reinforcing his belief that even the hardest hearts could soften given time. Others, however, doubled down on their resistance. Lieutenant Gregg, the veteran leading the dissenters, became increasingly vocal in his opposition. He filed petitions demanding the chief's removal, arguing that the reforms were divisive and counterproductive. His argument struck a chord with some, especially those who felt overwhelmed by the rapid changes. Yet city officials, impressed by the progress already underway, including plummeting civilian complaints and improved clearance rates, threw their full support behind the chief. For the first time, it seemed possible that the tide might actually turn. Through it all, the chief remained steadfast. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also understood the importance of staying the course. Every challenge, every obstacle only reinforced his commitment to building a better future, not just for the department, but for the community it served. And while the resistance showed no signs of fading completely, there were moments when it felt like the walls might finally start coming down. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the precinct parking lot. The chief stood outside his car reflecting on the day's events. The air was cool, carrying the faint hum of distant traffic. Despite the challenges, he felt a sense of purpose, a belief that the work they were doing mattered, not just for today but for generations to come. Change was never easy, but it was always worth fighting for. And fight he would, until justice prevailed. As the dust began to settle from the wave of arrests and disciplinary actions, something unexpected started to happen within the department. The cracks in the wall of resistance weren't just widening, they were crumbling. Officers who had once been vocal critics of the chief's reforms began to soften their stance, not because they agreed with him entirely, but because they saw the writing on the wall. Change was coming, whether they liked it or not, and fighting it tooth and nail wasn't going to stop it. Elena, the young officer who had quietly supported the chief from the start, found herself becoming a bridge between the two sides. She didn't shout her opinions from the rooftops or try to convince anyone overnight. Instead, she approached her colleagues one by one, sharing her perspective in low-key conversations during breaks or late-night shifts. "I get it," she'd say, leaning against a patrol car or sipping coffee in the break room. "Change feels scary, but if we don't fix this stuff ourselves, someone else will do it for us, and it won't be pretty." Her words resonated with some more than others. One older officer, a grizzled veteran named Ray, surprised everyone when he pulled her aside after roll call one day. Ray wasn't known for being talkative. He kept to himself most of the time, preferring action over words. But that day, he seemed different. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant as he spoke. "I've been thinking about what you said last week," he admitted, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "About how we can either lead the change or let it run us over." He paused, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm not saying I agree with everything the boss is doing, but maybe there's something to it." Elena nodded, careful not to push too hard. "It's okay to have doubts," she replied. "But at the end of the day, we all took an oath to serve and protect. If we're failing at that, whether it's through corruption or just turning a blind eye, it's on us to fix it." Ray didn't respond right away, but the look in his eyes said enough. He walked away without another word, leaving Elena wondering if she'd made any real impact. Still, moments like that gave her hope. For every officer who dug their heels in deeper, there was another willing to listen, even if only in private. Meanwhile, the chief continued pushing forward, determined to rebuild trust with the community. He knew arresting bad actors and punishing misconduct was only half the battle. Real reform meant showing people outside the department that things were actually changing, not just on paper, but in practice. To do that, he needed allies both, inside and outside the precinct. He reached out to local organizations, inviting leaders from marginalized communities to sit down and share their concerns. These meetings weren't easy. Some activists arrived angry, ready to vent years of frustration. Others were skeptical, convinced the department's efforts were nothing more than a PR stunt. But the chief listened patiently, letting them speak, without interruption. When it was his turn to respond, he didn't sugarcoat the truth. "I'm not here to tell you everything's fixed," he said during one particularly heated session. "Because it's not. But I promise you this. We're working on it. And if you want to hold us accountable, then do it. Push us. Challenge us. Because that's how we'll get better." His honesty struck a chord with many attendees. While not everyone walked away fully convinced, some left feeling cautiously optimistic. Word spread quickly through the neighborhoods, with residents beginning to notice small but meaningful changes. Officers started attending community events, handing out flyers about safety programs and answering questions face-to-face. Body cameras became mandatory for every interaction, and footage was regularly reviewed to ensure transparency. Slowly, the tension between the department and the public began to ease. Back at the station, the coalition of reform-minded officers grew stronger. What had started as a handful of individuals quietly supporting the chief blossomed into a larger movement. They organized informal meetings after hours, brainstorming ways to improve training programs and address systemic biases. Detective Rodriguez, a Latina officer who had faced discrimination herself, emerged as a key figure in these discussions. Her fiery passion and sharp insights inspired others to speak up, even those who had previously stayed silent. "We can't wait for someone else to fix this," she told the group during one meeting. "If we want to see real change, we have to be the ones driving it. That means calling out bad behavior when we see it, even if it's uncomfortable. It means mentoring new recruits and teaching them the right way to do this job. And most importantly, it means remembering why we joined this force in the first place." Her words lit a fire under everyone in the room. For the first time in years, officers felt a sense of purpose beyond simply clocking in and out. They began taking ownership of the reforms, suggesting ideas and volunteering for initiatives aimed at improving relations with the community. One program called Bridging the Gap paired officers with local youth for mentorship sessions. Another focused on de-escalation training, teaching officers how to handle high-pressure situations without resorting to force. Despite the progress, resistance still simmered beneath the surface. Lieutenant Gregg, the veteran leading the opposition, remained a thorn in the chief's side. He filed petitions demanding the boss's removal, accusing him of dividing the department and alienating officers. At roll calls and briefings, he openly criticized the reforms, urging his colleagues to stand firm against what he called unrealistic expectations. "You think holding hands and singing Kumbaya is going to solve our problems?" he snapped during one particularly heated argument. "Out there, it's life or death. You make one wrong move and it's your head on the chopping block. These policies are setting us up to fail." His arguments struck a nerve with some, especially younger officers who worried about making mistakes in such a charged environment. But for every person who sided with Gregg, there was another who pushed back. During one tense exchange, a rookie officer named Jake stood up, his voice shaking but resolute. "Maybe these policies aren't perfect," he said, addressing the room. "But isn't it better than doing nothing? Isn't it better than pretending everything's fine when we all know it's not?" The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Even Gregg didn't have a comeback. He muttered something under his breath and stormed off, leaving behind a mix of admiration and unease among the officers. As the weeks turned into months, the department began to transform in subtle yet significant ways. Complaints from civilians dropped dramatically, thanks in part to improved accountability measures. Clearance rates for crimes ticked upward, reflecting a renewed focus on solving cases rather than just responding to them. Officers reported feeling less burdened by the constant scrutiny, realizing that transparency actually made their jobs easier in the long run. City officials took notice, throwing their full support behind the chief's efforts. When Gregg submitted his petition for the boss's removal, it was swiftly rejected. Instead, the mayor praised the department's progress, calling it a model for other cities to follow. For the first time in years, the Chicago PD wasn't making headlines for scandals. It was making them for positive change. Still, the chief knew the work wasn't done. There would always be challenges, always be setbacks. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. Standing on the steps of City Hall after a ceremony honoring fallen officers, he reflected on how far they'd come. The road ahead was long, but for the first time it felt like they were heading in the right direction. "They thought their badge made them untouchable," he said in closing remarks, looking out at the crowd gathered below. "But today we've proven something far greater. That accountability makes us stronger." The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing through the streets of downtown Chicago. It was a sound filled with hope, a reminder that even the youth's hardest battles could be won with persistence, courage, and a willingness to confront the truth. Just when it seemed like the department was finally turning a corner, tragedy struck. It happened during a routine traffic stop, a situation so common that officers performed them almost on autopilot. The officer involved, Derek, was known around the precinct as someone who played by his own rules. He wasn't openly defiant like Lieutenant Gregg, but he had a reputation for bending procedures when it suited him. Some called it street smarts, others saw it as reckless. Either way, no one expected what unfolded that evening to become a flashpoint for everything the department had been working to overcome. It started with a simple broken taillight. Derek pulled over a teenager driving an old sedan in a quiet neighborhood. The kid, barely 16 with braces still on his teeth, seemed nervous but cooperative. He handed over his license and registration without argument, explaining that he was just running an errand for his mom. Through the car window, Derek spotted a wallet sitting on the passenger seat next to a bag of chips. Nothing about the scene raised any red flags, but something snapped inside Derek. Maybe it was the stress of recent months, the constant pressure to adapt to new policies, the feeling of being watched and judged at every turn. Or maybe it was something deeper, a reflex born from years of operating in a system where fear often outweighed reason. Whatever the cause, when the teenager reached toward the wallet to grab his ID, Derek interpreted the movement as a threat. In a split second, he drew his weapon and fired. The shot rang out like a thunderclap, shattering the calm of the evening. The teenager slumped forward, blood pooling on the driver's seat. By the time backup arrived, it was too late. Witnesses described the scene in stunned tones. The boy lying motionless, the wallet still sitting untouched on the seat beside him. Body cam footage later confirmed what many already suspected. The teen hadn't posed a threat. He'd simply been reaching for his wallet just as he'd said he would. News of the shooting spread like wildfire. Within hours, protests erupted across the city, with demonstrators chanting slogans and holding signs demanding justice. Social media lit up with outrage, videos of the incident going viral overnight. Reporters camped outside the precinct shouting questions at anyone who dared step outside. For the community, this wasn't just another tragic headline. It was proof that nothing had changed, that the reforms were all talk and no action. Inside the station, the mood was somber. Officers gathered in hushed clusters, exchanging uneasy glances. No one wanted to say it out loud, but the tension was palpable. Was this the moment the fragile progress they'd made would unravel? Would the public's trust, painstakingly rebuilt over months, crumble under the weight of yet another fatal mistake? The chief knew he couldn't afford to wait. He called an emergency meeting with senior staff, locking the door behind them. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with anxiety. When he spoke, his voice carried a mix of anger and exhaustion. "This isn't just about Derek," he said, pacing back and forth. "This is about us, about whether we can hold ourselves accountable even when it hurts. If we don't, then everything we've worked for means nothing." Captain Linda, who had once resisted reopening old cases, surprised everyone by speaking. "You're right," she admitted, her tone unusually subdued. "We've spent years covering up mistakes instead of learning from them. That stops now." With their support, the chief launched an immediate investigation into the shooting. Every piece of evidence was scrutinized, every angle explored. Derek cooperated reluctantly, insisting he'd acted in self-defense despite the clear contradictions in his account. When the findings were presented to the disciplinary board, the decision was unanimous. Derek would face charges for manslaughter, along with termination from the force. Announcing the outcome to the public wasn't easy. The chief stood before a packed press conference flanked by city officials and representatives from local advocacy groups. Cameras flashed as he stepped up to the podium, his expression grim but resolute. "Tonight, we mourn the loss of a young life cut tragically short," he began, pausing to let the gravity of the moment sink in. "And tonight we reaffirm our commitment to accountability. The officer responsible for this shooting has been charged, and he will answer for his actions, not because of who he is, but because of what he did." The crowd erupted in applause, though the cheers were tinged with sadness. For the victim's family, justice was bittersweet. Their son wouldn't come back, but at least they could take solace in knowing someone would be held responsible. Back at the precinct, emotions ran high. Some officers rallied around Derek, accusing the chief of throwing him under the bus to appease the public. Others wrestled with guilt, wondering if they too might have reacted differently in the same situation. Elena found herself caught in the middle again, torn between her loyalty to the badge and her belief in the reforms. She approached Derek personally, hoping to understand his perspective. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he told her, his voice trembling. "I swear I thought he was reaching for a gun. Everyone talks about how dangerous this job is, how you have to make split-second decisions. What was I supposed to do?" Elena listened without judgment, letting him vent his frustrations. But when he finished, she responded gently yet firmly. "Derek, I get it. This job is hard, it's scary. But that doesn't give us a free pass to act on instinct alone. We're trained to de-escalate, to think before we react. And if we mess up, if we fail, we have to own it. That's what accountability looks like." Her words hit home, though not immediately. Derek ultimately chose to resign rather than face trial, leaving behind a cloud of uncertainty. Would other officers see his punishment as a warning or as proof that the reforms were too harsh? The chief knew the answer depended on how they handled the aftermath. In the weeks that followed, he made it a priority to address the root causes of the tragedy. He introduced mandatory mental health check-ins for officers, recognizing the toll the job took on their well-being. Training programs focused heavily on de-escalation techniques, teaching officers how to defuse tense situations without resorting to force. Community forums became regular events, giving residents a platform to share their concerns and suggestions directly with the department. Slowly but surely, the atmosphere within the precinct began to shift. Conversations that once centered on blame and defensiveness evolved into discussions about growth and improvement. Officers started opening up about the challenges they faced, seeking advice rather than hiding behind bravado. Even some of Derek's former supporters softened their stance, admitting that accountability wasn't the enemy. It was the key to rebuilding trust. For the chief, these small victories meant everything. He knew the road ahead would always be fraught with obstacles, but each step forward reinforced his belief in the power of change. Justice wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It was about creating a culture where such mistakes were less likely to happen in the first place. One evening, as he walked through the nearly empty halls of the station, he paused to look at the photos lining the walls. They depicted decades of history, officers posing proudly in uniform, community events celebrating partnerships past. Someday, he hoped, future generations would look back on this era not as a dark chapter, but as a turning point, a moment when the department chose to confront its flaws head-on and emerge stronger for it. As he turned off the lights and locked the door behind him, he allowed himself a rare smile. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were winning. Months had passed since the shooting that shook the department to its core. The city was quieter now, the protests fading into memory as life moved forward. But inside the precinct, the echoes of that night lingered, a constant reminder of how fragile progress could be. The chief stood on the steps of City Hall one crisp autumn morning, addressing a crowd gathered for a ceremony honoring fallen officers. His presence commanded attention, not because of his rank, but because of what he represented: resilience, accountability, and hope. The ceremony itself was somber, yet hopeful. Families of officers who had lost their lives in the line of duty sat in the front row, clutching photos and flowers. Behind them, rows of uniformed officers stood at attention, their badges gleaming in the sunlight. It was a moment of reflection, not just for those being honored, but for everyone who wore the badge. For years, this event had been steeped in tradition, a chance to celebrate heroism and sacrifice. This year, however, it carried an added weight. The department wasn't just mourning losses, it was reckoning with its past. As the chief stepped up to the podium, the murmurs of the crowd died down. He began by acknowledging the pain still fresh in the community's collective memory. "We gather here today not only to honor those we've lost, but to remind ourselves of why we serve," he said, his voice steady and clear. "A badge isn't a shield from criticism, it's a promise to protect, to listen, and to do better when we fall short." His words resonated deeply, especially among the officers standing nearby. Some nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably, their minds drifting back to the mistakes they'd made or witnessed over the years. The chief didn't shy away from the discomfort. If anything, he leaned into it. knowing that growth often came from confronting hard truths. He went on to highlight the changes that had taken root within the department. Stricter use of force policies had reduced incidents of excessive force. Body cameras were now mandatory for every interaction, ensuring transparency. Partnerships with local organizations had strengthened ties between officers and the communities they served. These weren't just numbers on a report. They were tangible, improvements that people could see and feel. But the chief didn't sugarcoat things either. He admitted that challenges remained. Trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight, and there would always be moments when the system faltered. What mattered most, he emphasized, was how they responded to those failures. Accountability isn't punishment, he said firmly. It's a chance to learn, to grow, and to prove that we're worthy of the trust placed in us. The applause that followed was heartfelt, a mix of gratitude and determination. For many in the audience, it felt like a turning point, a recognition that the department was finally moving in the right direction. Even Lieutenant Gregg, who had long resisted the reforms, seemed subdued. Standing near the back of the crowd, he watched silently as the ceremony unfolded. Though he hadn't publicly softened his stance, his body language suggested a shift. Maybe it was resignation, or maybe it was acceptance. Either way, the fire in him had dimmed. After the ceremony, the chief mingled with attendees, shaking hands and exchanging quiet words of thanks. Elena approached him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think we're getting closer?" she asked, referring to the elusive goal of true reform. "We are," he replied without hesitation. "But it's not about crossing some finish line. It's about staying committed to the process, even when it's hard." Her eyes softened, and she nodded. "I guess that's what makes it worth it, huh?" He smiled faintly. "Exactly." Back at the precinct, the transformation continued. Officers who had once resisted change now embraced it, seeing firsthand how it improved both their work and their relationships with the community. Roll calls included discussions about de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity training. Community outreach programs became a regular part of the schedule, giving officers opportunities to connect with residents outside the confines of patrol cars and radios. One initiative, called Coffee with Cops, proved particularly successful. Once a month, officers set up tables at local cafes, inviting residents to stop by for casual conversations. At first, turnout was sparse, with only a handful of curious neighbors showing up. But over time, word spread, and the events grew busier. People brought questions, concerns, and even compliments. Officers listened intently, jotting down notes and promising follow-ups. Slowly, the barriers between us and them began to dissolve. Even skeptical residents started noticing differences. Complaints about misconduct plummeted, replaced by stories of positive interactions. Kids waved at passing patrol cars instead of averting their eyes. Store owners greeted officers warmly, thanking them for their presence rather than viewing them as threats. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, but the overall tone had shifted. For the chief, these small victories meant everything. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but each step forward reinforced his belief in the power of perseverance. Late one evening, as he prepared to leave the station, he paused to look around the bustling room. Officers laughed and joked during downtime, their camaraderie genuine rather than forced. The walls, once dull and lifeless, now featured posters promoting diversity and inclusion. Even the air smelled cleaner, free of the lingering bitterness that had once permeated the space. As he locked the door behind him, he took a deep breath, savoring the cool night air. The city stretched out before him, alive with lights and sounds. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, a reminder that the job was never truly done. But for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. They had come so far, from resistance to acceptance, from division to unity, and though challenges lay ahead, he believed they were ready to face them. The badge no longer symbolized untouchability. Instead, it represented responsibility, a promise to serve with integrity, humility, and courage. And as the chief walked toward his car, He allowed himself a rare moment of pride. Change was possible. It was hard, messy, and imperfect, but it was possible. And that was enough.